All right, Friedrick Hoelzel and the Ivory Dome theory revisited. I got a modified understanding of this theory, and I think I can explain it better now, and how it connects to this what we see going on here. All these bulgy cone heads. So if you're unfamiliar with the Ivory Dome theory, so this guy Friedrich Hoelzel in 1942 wrote this correspondence about his findings, where he did autopsies. I think he was a German physician. He did 80 autopsies, and he said there's an obvious relation between blood vessels supply to the scalp and the quality of the hair. Baldness occurred in persons in whom calcification of the skull bones apparently had not only firmly knitted the cranial sutures, but also closed or narrowed various small foramens through which blood vessels pass, most prominently in persons with a luxuriant crop of hair. So meaning so bald guys had all their, the cranial sutures were calcified, as opposed to people who were not bald, the cranial sutures were not calcified. And this blood vessel connection, he's saying that it affects veins that communicate through the diploic vein system, and because of calcification of the foramens, which are little holes, which I'll go over now. So these are the sutures. You have this is the sagittal, coronal, the major sutures. So these are where the bones met and kind of connected as your skull was growing as an infant. So what Friedrich Hoelzel is saying is that these sutures are getting calcified over. They're not supposed to be calcified, but for men with male pattern baldness, for some reason, these are getting calcified. And I guess he just blamed it on whatever. Males are more, calcification is generally greater in males than females, right? Oh, so that's it. Males are more prone to calcification. So for some males, it's just randomly calcifying, which I don't think is going on. But anyway, this is what's calcifying: the sutures, and then these holes. These are the foramen. These are what he's talking about, the blood vessel supply. Blood vessels and the blood supply. But these pinch off the veins, not the arteries. So it's so I guess do I have, see here's some other picture. This is a real picture. There's the suture. Here's the foramen, parietal foramen. There are other foramen on there too, that you can't see in that picture. They're a little blurry. This is so there's another suture that wasn't in the other picture. This is the metopic suture. This is the suture that runs down the frontal bone, which is a little fainter than the other sutures. But and then you have these occipital sutures here, and you get a different view of the foramen. Right? Foramen there, foramen there. So anyway, with these foramen, he's saying, okay, I think what's going on is the sutures that he didn't really have an explanation for, why would that cause male pattern baldness. But he said because these foramen are getting calcified shut, it's pinching off the blood vessels, but the blood vessels are veins. Right? So blood vessels come from the skin, and then they flush through the foramen into what's called the diploic venous network. So this is a giant venous network within the skull, in the spongy tissue. So within, you have skull plates, hard bone on the outside, hard bone on the inside, and then you have these veins and spongy tissue that's on the inside of the skull, in between the hard bony parts, and that flushes blood out of the skull. But why would the veins veins take the blood back to the heart, right? They're not feeding the heart the blood, so it doesn't really make sense. And I couldn't really figure it out, how would that even matter? And ultimately it doesn't, and that's not really what's going on. It's not a matter of blood supply that's causing all this stuff going on here, right? This is not a matter of, to some degree it is blood supply, but that's not the main issue. This bulging, this is the calcification that I'm thinking is causing male pattern baldness, and this bulging phenomenon that occurs in the frontal area or the crown. So why might that occur, and how does that relate to calcification? Because it is calcification, it's bone growth. Well, I've gotten into energy medicine, and Chinese medicine is the one I have the most familiarity with, and I found it to be very useful in this respect. So this is near the crown. Yeah, so this point sits probably right about here. along the suture lines. This is the Baihui do 20, so do my 20 acupuncture point. So this point is on a major, what's called yang meridian. So yang energy, the energy that rises up in your body, and it runs along. It comes through this. It comes through your spinal cord. All your yang energy, the energy of like your thinking, the male energy, your active, mental, physical, all that go energy, sympathetic nervous system energy comes up the spinal cord and then comes out the Baihui and then down the face. So all your yang energy, this is the port. Like it's coming out. Some of it goes out into the ether because that's where yang energy is meant to be in the heavens. But it comes out this point and then runs along. Some of it runs along the midline of the skull, and other amount of it just radiates out into the ether. And when this surges, when this yang energy surges up through, and this is the only port, right? It's pretty much it. It's the only way, like the only natural way out. I think it can put a lot of pressure in this area, right? And because it's electrical energy, like it's something. There's a force there, and since it sits right here, right, there's a lot of upward force, outward force, in this area, and I think that can also create like this electrical vacuum. If your neck muscles get really tight, it could pinch off the feeding point into this point along the neck. So, and then what that would do is it creates a pressure point, a severe, like a really intense pressure point if your neck muscles are tight, because it creates this electrical vacuum and pressure point here at the Baihui, just the physics of it with electricity. Oops, there we go. And then so since it's hit right, if there's a huge like pressure area that's right at the interior wall of the skull, pushing constantly right here, an abnormal force that the skull is not intended to absorb, right? Imagine this is a very weak point of the skull, right? If there's a lot of pressure, because you have this, which is not calcified shut, right? This is not calcified shut. This is just the skull fitting together, right? There's nothing firmly knitting the plates, the frontal bone, the parietal bones. It's just, they're just kind of pieced together, and you have this huge pressure right here at this yang energy point. So I'm thinking this is a area of weakness in the skull where these sutures meet. Right? And there's also the metopic suture here. So it's an area of it's not pictured, but like it runs here. You have 4 sutures meeting and a huge pressure point right here. I'm thinking, why would the body calcify the sutures here in some men and not in others? And I think it's because this pressure, like if there's an intense force here pushing out, the body's going to have to reinforce the skull. Like it doesn't want this area just breaking open and brain being exposed. So it calcifies these sutures, lays down bone, especially right here. It just starts laying down bone in this vulnerable area, and it piles up, and you get this. Right, why else would there? Why, like this guy just thinks like, I mean, it's brilliant. Like he made this connection, but just like, oh, it's just body's just randomly calcifying the skull, and so that's why men get bald, because it's cutting off the blood supply. Like, no, it is creating this bulge. It's laying down bone to protect itself. It's not random. There's a huge pressure point there, right? There's a huge pressure point here, and the body is laying down bone in this area. This is the crown. This is where the bulge forms. This is a little bit stacked. Like this is not, it looks like the front of the head. This is more like the back of the head. That's where your sagittal sutures run. They run along your ears, not the front. This looks more like the front of the ears. It's more like the back of the ears, right? Laying down bone here, trying to reinforce the areas of weakness because of a surging force at this Baihui acupuncture point, right? That's the connection. That's what's going on. And then obviously, like, so when more calcium gets laid down, that's going to stretch out the galea. That's going to compress the arteries in the skull, and that's going to thin out your hair. But it's not going to cause the pattern loss. The bulge is going to create the pattern loss. It's going to create that bald spot, because the body doesn't recognize it as like the top of your head anymore. And then the stretching galea will thin out the rest of it. And then that's why you have pattern loss that gets diffused, and then finally you're totally bald. But anyway, the calcification is to reinforce the skull. And then the parietal, so these foramen, they're not getting calcified shut randomly either. So foramen, holes in your skull, are also vulnerable points where the skull can crack, right? That's what the body wants to prevent. It doesn't want your skull to crack from this upward surging pressure here. So it's going to reinforce the areas of weakness, which is the sutures, and then the holes, right? You think like there's an outward force on a plate. What's the point of weakness? Well, where it meets another plate and there's not like a binding agent there, and where there's a hole, right? Reinforcement is just laying down calcium to reinforce the structural integrity of the skull. That's what I think is going on. And then the other aspect, like, how do you get this bulge in the front? Right, so there's the bulge in the crown bulge, but Statham here, he's got the bulge in the front. Well, here's the prefrontal cortex sitting right there, right behind the bulge in the upper part of the forehead. This is where the prefrontal cortex is. There's a bulging at the prefrontal cortex. And that is occurring because of this metopic suture. The act of thinking requires a huge energetic draw. And a metabolic, an increased metabolic activity. So there's going to be swelling due to increased metabolic activity. There's a lot of heat in the brain. It's going to cause the tissue to swell, and put some outward force on the frontal bone. Got to reinforce that frontal bone now because of too much thinking, too much metabolic activity, too much heat, too much swelling. There's an outward force. We have to protect the skull from cracking, lay down bone. Also electrical activity, that yang is going to rise up into the prefrontal cortex and it's going to start banging against the frontal bone, creating friction. That's going to increase heat as well and cause more swelling. And then the other aspect to it, which I think is more important, is that if with really intense high velocity thinking, it's going to emanate out. That's where yang energy wants to get out in the ether. And I think what's going on, you get a lot of thinking, a lot of energy. Some of that's going to permeate the bone layer, bone tissue, and it's going to send shock waves. Right? Shock waves are just shooting through the frontal bone when you get into like really obsessive thinking, because the skull's not, your body's not designed to do obsessive thinking. It's designed to think, but not obsessive thinking. It's going to go out straight through the bone, I think. And these shock waves are going to, it's going to stimulate the osteoblast to lay down bone, because they're going to be like, oh, there's a trauma in the area. We have to reinforce the bone even more. So it starts laying down bone in the metopic suture, and then you get this bulge here in the front, protecting the brain from all these shock waves running out of the prefrontal cortex. Not that I think Matt Holliday here is a particularly academic guy, or maybe he is, I don't know. But males think. That's the male function. Males are much more susceptible to really rational, abstract thinking, and we're trained to do it from a young age. And certain skulls are more prone to this bulging than others. Right? Naturally rounded skulls are going to be weaker. There's just like a leverage factor, and they were going to require more structural reinforcement than a more vertical and more angled skull. And you can see on me, there's my frontal bulge. Right, look at that round forehead. That forehead should be flat. Right, before I started balding, it was flat. This whole area did not exist. Body started laying down bone to protect the metopic suture. So that's what I think is going on. It's not blood vessels, blood veins being pinched off. That's the calcification. It's these sutures that are being reinforced with bone to protect the skull from an outward force in both the crown and the forehead area. That's what makes more sense to me. Why else would the body waste all this calcium on the skull, right? For no reason. Men are more prone to calcification. It doesn't make sense. What makes sense is like the body is trying to structurally reinforce the skull because of an outward force that it's not designed to withstand. So that's my new take on the Friedrick Hoelzel Ivory dome theory, and it explains more why you get a dome. A lot of males have a dome shape. This is a little domier. This is a little domier, right? It's an actual dome because the body's laying down calcium to protect itself, reinforce the skull, and it comes out in a bone shape, or a dome. It's not a bone shape, a dome shape. So there you go. That's my theory on the ivory dome theory.